For 8 years I thought I had the kind of marriage that made other men jealous. Or at least quietly miserable in their own lives because they weren't married to a woman like Karina who could make a room stop breathing when she walked in and make you feel like a better man just for being next to her. I played my part with pride because I was the reliable one, the steady one, the one who fixed porch steps and unclogged drains and said I love you every morning like a ritual I believed mattered until the day I sat standing at her father's funeral and realized I didn't have a seat in her story anymore. You'd think after nearly a decade of marriage I'd be given a chair at the front. Especially considering I was the one who had driven Glenn Darby to every single one of his physical therapy appointments, even when I had a busted transmission and a fever that made the world tilt sideways. But instead, my wife's handbag had more authority than I did because it was occupying my seat at the memorial. When I asked Karina about it, she told me with the kind of smile people use on children or unwanted guests that I should stand with the cousins near the Christmas tree, which I guess was her poetic way of saying I didn't belong anymore. She delivered a eulogy that would have made angels weep if angels cared about business acumen and charitable tax write-offs. She never once mentioned my name, not even a casual nod to the man who had installed handrails in her father's shower and spent hours listening to war stories while stirring chicken soup like it was a sacred recipe. Instead, she spoke about loyalty and family and support like those things came in Armani suits and trust funds, not in torn jeans and a two-handled plunger. The rest of the crowd followed her lead like trained seals clapping on cue. When the final hymn rolled out and Karina looked my way, there was nothing in her eyes but that same hollow smile I'd seen her practice in front of mirrors, the one she used for photo ops and performance reviews. That's when it hit me. This wasn't grief. This was theater, and I wasn't even cast in a supporting role anymore. 2 days later, she slid divorce papers across our kitchen table with the kind of calm efficiency you usually reserve for spreadsheets or grocery lists. When I asked her why, she said she was choosing herself, which was odd considering she'd been choosing herself every day since the wedding. When I pointed out the timing, she shrugged like it was just another calendar item to tick off before the real fun began. That's when I saw the truth. Not all at once, but like fog lifting from a windshield after a long cold drive. It wasn't just the funeral. It wasn't just the divorce. It was the years of calculation, the years of letting me believe we were building something together when really I was just a placeholder, a stepping stone, a convenient shadow she could shape her narrative around. The irony, the real punchline of the whole joke, was that her father, the man she had tried to edge me out of everything for, had left me everything he had and her almost nothing. I didn't understand it then, not fully, but I understood enough to know that something had shifted permanently in my world. That shift would lead to truths I wasn't ready for and choices I never thought I'd have to make. But the game had started, and I wasn't playing defense anymore. There are moments in life where the floor doesn't just fall out from under you. It shatters like old ice, and you realize you've been walking across a frozen lake for years, convinced it was solid ground. The will reading was one of those moments because I went in expecting nothing and came out with a fortune and a question I still haven't been able to answer. I didn't even plan on attending the will reading, not because I wasn't curious but because I'd just finished watching my wife erase 8 years of marriage with a few strokes of a pen. The idea of sitting quietly while she claimed her inheritance and basked in everyone's sympathy felt like volunteering for a firing squad. But then something inside me, maybe spite, maybe pride, maybe something nobler I haven't met yet, said go and see what she does with victory in her hand. So I put on my best suit, which isn't saying much, and walked into that law office expecting to be ignored and overlooked and possibly escorted out. But instead, the receptionist blinked at her screen twice and then told me I was on the list, and that should have been my first clue that the script had been rewritten while Karina was busy preparing her acceptance speech for a show she didn't realize had a twist ending. They stuck me in a corner chair in Conference Room B, which is the legal equivalent of the kids' table at Thanksgiving. I took my seat like a good ghost while Karina held court at the head table in designer morning attire, probably paid for with her corporate bonus. When the lawyer started reading, I half listened, thinking I'd be named in a footnote, maybe a token gesture for all the Sundays spent with Glenn when no one else showed up. But then came the words, "To my beloved daughter Karina, I leave $1 million," and the air changed. You could hear the pause in every breath in the room because everyone had been expecting her to get everything, and instead, she got a piece, a crumb, a consolation prize. And before anyone could process that, the next sentence landed like a brick through stained glass. The remainder of my estate I leave to my son-in-law Wendell Morrison. I didn't feel joy, not right away. I felt confusion, then disbelief, then a kind of numb heat that settled in my chest because Glenn Darby, the man whose daughter had just divorced me, had left me his empire while giving her a polite pat on the back. I didn't know what to do with that kind of unexpected power except sit there and try to keep breathing. Karina's face changed in stages. First confusion, then panic, then that brand of icy rage that used to be reserved for baristas who got her order wrong. She tried to protest, tried to call it a mistake, but the lawyer had receipts, documents, a letter from Glenn himself, and no room left for argument. The room, which had just been hers, turned away like a flock sensing a shift in the wind. She didn't speak to me after that, not directly, not with words, but her eyes did, and they said something worse than anger. They said unfinished, and in that look, I saw the future because I knew she wouldn't let this go. Not quietly, not gracefully, and certainly not without trying to take back what she believed was hers by birthright. 3 days later, she showed up at my job, still in heels, still in control, or so she thought, and dropped a folder on my desk, offering me a buyout. A cool $5 million in exchange for walking away from the estate and the legacy and the last word. But what she didn't understand, what she couldn't understand, was that this wasn't about money. Not for me, not anymore. This was about betrayal and revelation and the kind of justice that doesn't show up in courtrooms or ledgers but in the quiet satisfaction of knowing someone finally saw you. Not as an accessory but as a man. And that's when I realized the will wasn't just about inheritance. It was about inheritance of a different kind, about being seen and chosen and trusted by someone who had no reason to do any of those things unless they'd been watching closely for a very long time. That's when the game changed, and I stopped reacting and started preparing. Now, you'd think inheriting a fortune would come with a sense of triumph or at least a few nights of restful sleep and steak dinners. But what it really came with was a warning call from the attorney and a condition that made my stomach feel like I'd swallowed a live wire because apparently, Glenn Darby had known his daughter well enough to include an 18-month clause in his will, stating that if I got back together with Karina, a full 40% of the inheritance would be rerouted to a dog sanctuary. And not just any sanctuary, but one with a name so whimsical it sounded like a joke. Sunset Hills Dog Sanctuary, the kind of place that sent out Christmas cards with beagles and Santa hats. I sat there with the phone pressed to my ear, listening to Glenn's lawyer read a posthumous letter written in that man's unmistakable voice, and I could almost hear his chuckle under the words as he warned me not to let Karina leash me again. Not to accept scraps from someone who saw me as a temporary convenience and not a partner because apparently he'd seen it all, the way she dismissed me in public and the way I made excuses for it in private. The way she offered just enough affection to keep me tethered but never enough to feel full. And that was the moment I knew for sure he hadn't just given me money. He'd given me freedom. But Karina wasn't done yet, and she sure wasn't stupid because that Sunday, she showed up unannounced at my cousin Jake's barbecue, dressed in the kind of nostalgia that looked like our wedding photo and carried the scent of regret mixed with a plan. She sat beside me on the swing like we were back in those early days before the ambition swallowed the warmth, and the ambition got real loud, real fast. She handed me a photograph from our wedding day, with the edges soft and the colors warm like a memory trying too hard, and said something about how we were good once and maybe we could be good again. I looked at that picture and remembered the bakery apartment, the burned toast, and the shared blankets on winter mornings. It hit me like a slap to the soul how much of that was real and how much of it had been performance because Karina could sell sentiment the way some people sell cars. She knew just how to steer the conversation to make you believe you'd always been driving. I told her about the clause in the will, and the look on her face went cold, then pale, then empty, like she'd swallowed every dollar she thought she was getting and now couldn't taste anything but bitterness. She said the money didn't matter, and I told her to prove it by walking away. She said she couldn't, and that's when I knew I wasn't dealing with a woman trying to rekindle love. I was dealing with someone trying to renegotiate a deal that had fallen apart on the closing table. She told me she loved me, and I told her she loved the idea of controlling me. She didn't deny it. She just walked away with that same over-the-shoulder threat she always used when she thought her absence would hurt more than her presence. But this time I let her leave and I didn't chase her. That's when I realized she didn't have power over me anymore. Jake joined me on the swing after she left, and we didn't say much, but his silence was loud with understanding. I told him what the lawyer had said and what Glenn had written, and we both just stared out at the grill like two men who knew the storm wasn't over, and the next bolt of lightning was going to aim low. And I was right, because 2 weeks later, I found a letter in my mailbox. No return address, just one sentence typed in bold font like a riddle with fangs. There are things you don't know, Wendell. Be careful who you trust with Glenn's secrets. And suddenly, it wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about danger. You ever have that feeling like the world just shifted under your feet, but everything around you keeps pretending it's stable and fine? Like the birds still chirp and the neighbors still wave, but deep in your gut, something is screaming that the rules have changed, and you'd better figure out how before they change again. Well, that's what that letter did to me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Glenn's death had more to it than a heart attack and a closed casket. The problem with suspicion is it doesn't give you peace. It gives you questions, and then those questions start scratching at the walls of your mind like a trapped animal. You can't sleep because your brain is replaying every odd moment from the last few months like a bad movie on a loop, and pretty soon you're standing in a dead man's study at 10 o'clock at night, opening drawers and checking behind bookshelves because somebody told you there were secrets, and now you need to know them whether you're ready or not. The house still smelled like Glenn, cedar and old cigars, and the kind of cologne you only wear when you've earned every wrinkle. As I moved through the place, it felt like I was being watched, not by ghosts, but by the weight of what hadn't been said and what had been said just carefully enough to stay hidden. It took hours of digging, but eventually, I found it, tucked away in a forgotten folder on his desktop labeled just one word: legal. Buried inside were server logs, email chains, and timestamps that painted a picture I didn't want to see. A picture of Karina accessing his legal files, trying to override clauses in his will, and spending late nights in his house on days she claimed to be traveling for work. Suddenly, her grief at the funeral looked a lot more like damage control. But it wasn't just what she did. It was what she failed to do. Because for all her attempts to erase my name from Glenn's estate, she didn't succeed. And that meant Glenn knew he was being watched, knew someone was trying to manipulate his legacy, and somehow found a way to fight back. That meant he knew something was coming. And that's when I remembered something odd he'd once said when I brought him soup after a doctor visit. How he kept checking his locks and feeling sick after certain meals. How he once joked that his own house felt like enemy territory. Back then, I just thought it was the meds talking or old man paranoia, but now I wasn't so sure. I started searching the house again, not just for files or passwords, but for something more personal, something handwritten. And I found it in the most unexpected place. Taped to the underside of a drawer, like a last-ditch message in a spy novel. If something happens to me, look for the blue folder in the kitchen pantry, third shelf behind the cereal boxes. And I went to that pantry. I moved the cereal and I found the folder. I opened it, and that's when the world really changed. Inside were receipts for medications not prescribed to Glenn, pharmacy logs showing cash purchases of heart-related drugs, and a private investigator's report detailing Karina's financial troubles, which she'd never mentioned, not even during the divorce. The centerpiece was a handwritten letter from Glenn himself, dated 3 weeks before he died. I suspect my daughter is trying to eliminate me. She's been bringing meals and drinks that make me sick. I've had chest pains after every visit. If something happens to me, I want Wendell to know the truth about the woman he married. And there it was. Not just betrayal, but premeditation. I sat in that pantry for a long time, holding a piece of paper that turned grief into suspicion and love into liability. I knew that I was sitting on a powder keg, and someone was about to light a match. And sure enough, my phone rang and her name popped up on the screen. When I answered, the first thing she said was, "You found it, didn't you? Next part's ready when you are." This is where the real unraveling begins. The moment she spoke those words, "You found it, didn't you?" I knew the game had changed. And not in the fun, chess with a friend kind of way, but more like you're halfway through a puzzle only to realize the picture is a map, and someone's already following the route with a gun in their hand and your name on their list. That's because that tone she used wasn't casual. It was calculated and sharp like a scalpel, ready to cut away anything that didn't fit her version of the story. I played dumb, of course, not because I'm good at it, but because it was the only card I had left in that moment. So I asked her what she was talking about, and she didn't answer directly, which told me more than if she had recited the contents of that blue folder from memory. What she did instead was accuse me of being the last person to see her father alive and said something about the soup I brought him being suspicious. Maybe I had more motive than she did to change that will, and the air in the room turned cold enough to see my breath. She was spinning the wheel fast, trying to make it land on anything but herself. The thing is, if you're not prepared for that kind of conversation, it can work. It can make you question your own memory, your own actions, your own intentions. But I'd read Glenn's letter. I'd seen the receipts. I knew the difference between a man who died naturally and a man who knew the clock was being wound down for him by someone he should have been able to trust. That difference was sitting in my lap in black ink and fear. But the most chilling part of the call wasn't what she said. It was what she knew. She knew I'd been in the house. She knew I'd been in the pantry. She knew I had seen what he left behind, and that meant one of two things. Either she had someone watching me, or she was still in control of something I hadn't found yet. That realization settled in my chest like concrete. So I said nothing and hung up the phone. The next day, I drove back to Glenn's house, expecting more questions, but what I found instead was the front door wide open and the study ransacked. Like someone had gone through it with the desperation of a gambler down to their last chip. That told me all I needed to know. She was scared. Not just angry, not just vindictive, but genuinely frightened that I had something that could tear her world apart. And the thing is, she wasn't wrong. I called the police and they treated it like a standard break-in, which meant nothing was dusted and no one cared because rich people get robbed all the time, and insurance handles the cleanup. But this wasn't about missing jewelry or stolen laptops. This was about silencing a story and deleting a legacy. Whoever tore apart that study wasn't looking for valuables. They were looking for evidence. But they missed something, because Glenn, bless the old man's paranoid heart, had taped a second note underneath the desk drawer. One that said, "If something happens and the folder is gone, check the bottom of the wine cabinet behind the third bottle from the left." And sure enough, I found a USB drive tucked behind a dusty bottle of Cabernet. When I opened it that night on a secure laptop, it contained voice memos. 12 of them, dated and time-stamped in Glenn's voice, chronicling his symptoms, his suspicions, and his regret about the daughter he tried so hard to protect, even when she stopped trying to protect him. By the end of the last recording, his voice was weak, barely more than a whisper, but still clear enough to make the hair on my arms stand up. If you're listening, Wendell, then I'm probably gone. And if you're still married to Karina, don't be anymore. And if she comes to you with tears, remember this. She only cries when she's cornered. And that's when I knew I had to make a choice. Not about the money, not about revenge, not even about justice, but about truth. And whether I was strong enough to see it all the way through. There's a moment in every man's life where he realizes he's no longer trying to survive a storm. He's become it. And that moment came for me the night I sat in my living room listening to Glenn's final message for the third time and felt something shift in me. Not like a crack or a break, but more like a slow, quiet settling of bone and muscle into a shape I hadn't worn before. Because this wasn't about grief anymore. This was about war, and I had just been handed the map and the matchbook. Karina must have sensed the shift too, because the next evening, she showed up again. Not with papers or lawyers or threats, but with dinner, a soft smile, a bottle of wine, and a story about how she missed the life we had and wanted to try again. The performance would have won her an Oscar if I hadn't already read the script and known how it ended. Because underneath the red lipstick, the silk blouse, and the sudden affection, there was fear, and it wore her skin like a tight dress 2 sizes too small. She asked me if I'd thought about us, about the way things used to be, and I told her I thought about a lot of things lately. Like how quickly people move on from funerals and how some losses feel more like revelations than wounds. She laughed nervously and said she didn't understand, and I told her she didn't have to because I did, and that was enough for now. She left without pushing, but I knew she'd be back. Sure enough, a few days later, another envelope appeared in my mailbox with no return address and no explanation. Just one photo. A grainy image of Karina standing outside a pharmacy at 10 o'clock at night with a small brown paper bag in her hand and a date and timestamp that matched one of the receipts Glenn had kept. The message on the back of the photo was written in block letters. "She's not done." I didn't know who was sending these messages, but I knew two things for certain. One, they weren't on Karina's side, and two, they wanted me to act. I wasn't sure if that made them a friend or an accomplice, but I was listening now, and they knew it. So I called the lawyer, the one Glenn had trusted, and I told him everything. Not just the inheritance and the recordings, but the photos, the break-in, the threats, the silence. And he listened the way good lawyers do, with a kind of stillness that makes you feel like you're building a case even before you know what the charge is. And when I finished, he asked me one question that stopped me cold. "Are you ready to go public?" I wasn't sure if I was, because once the story left my hands, it wasn't mine anymore. And there's something terrifying about exposing the truth when the lie has been so carefully constructed that even you wanted to believe it for a long time. But then I thought about Glenn and how he trusted me to finish the story he couldn't. And I thought about all the men like me who spend their lives carrying someone else's burden just to be thrown out like an empty shell when they're no longer convenient. So I said yes. And that yes set everything in motion. The lawyer filed a motion to secure the remaining evidence. The police reopened the inquiry under pressure from a growing stack of suspicious documentation. And Karina? Well, she responded exactly as expected. By turning the volume up. She showed up at my door in tears, talking about threats and confusion and manipulation, and how maybe her father had been sicker than we thought, and maybe the documents were forged, and maybe I'd been misled by someone trying to drive us apart. I let her speak because I needed to hear just how far she was willing to go to stay one step ahead of the avalanche she saw coming. And then she said it, that maybe I had something to do with Glenn's death. And that's when I knew. She wasn't going to let this end with dignity or silence or even civility. This was going to be scorched earth. And I had to decide if I was willing to burn too. There's a kind of silence that follows a final decision. Not the peaceful kind that wraps around you like a blanket, but the heavy kind that presses down like a ceiling about to collapse. That's what settled over me after Karina pointed her perfectly manicured finger in my direction and accused me of poisoning the man who gave me everything. Because at that moment, the mask was gone, the performance was over, and what stood in front of me wasn't a grieving daughter or a wounded wife, but a cornered predator clutching at the last threads of her story before it unraveled completely. I didn't say a word as she left because some endings don't need punctuation, and some exits are better watched than interrupted. The sound of her heels echoing down my driveway felt like the ticking of a clock counting down to something inevitable. We were no longer battling for truth. We were battling for control, and she was losing grip while I was just learning how to use mine. The next few days were a storm of motions and countermotions, headlines and speculation. The will was challenged, the recordings were subpoenaed, the photos were analyzed, and the whispers turned into questions. Those questions turned into headlines, and suddenly Karina's name wasn't just whispered at fundraisers. It was printed on the front pages next to words like motive and investigation. Suddenly, she wasn't just a daughter of wealth and ambition. She was a woman with too many secrets and not enough alibis. But the moment it all truly cracked wasn't in a courtroom or a headline. It was at a press conference where her lawyer tried to paint her as a victim. One of the reporters held up a photo of her standing outside that pharmacy and asked why she was purchasing unprescribed medication hours before Glenn's final episode. When she stammered and blinked and said she couldn't recall that moment, the one blink was all it took to shift public opinion. The world doesn't like uncertainty in the eyes of the confident. And that's when I knew the fight was no longer mine to lead. It was hers to lose. Still, I didn't celebrate. Not because I wasn't vindicated, but because some victories come dressed in ashes, and the cost of this one had been a version of myself I'd never see again. The man who believed in loyalty without proof, the man who believed love was enough, the man who stood beside a Christmas tree at his father-in-law's funeral and still hoped for acknowledgement. That man was gone. In his place stood someone new, someone quiet but unshakable, someone who had learned how to read people without listening to their words, someone who no longer asked for a seat at the table. He just built a new one. I watched from a distance as the case played out. Her reputation crumbled, her allies vanished, her story collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. In the end, she walked away, not in handcuffs but in disgrace. which in her world was a far worse punishment. As for me, I kept the house, the business, and the silence. Because sometimes dignity isn't in the retaliation. It's in the refusal. 18 months passed. The clause expired. The inheritance was mine, free and clear. By then, the thought of reconciliation was as foreign to me as the man I used to be. I stood one morning on the porch of Glenn's house, coffee in hand, watching the sun break through the trees. I remembered his last words, the ones about crumbs and freedom and seeing the truth, and I finally understood what he meant. She only gave me crumbs. But I had learned how to build bread from nothing. And I was never going back to hungry. That's the end of this story. But not the last one I'll ever tell. Because once you've walked through betrayal and come out the other side, you realize the real story was never about what was taken from you. It was always about what you found in the ruins.